It's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker in tonight's program, Dr. Derek Yak. Derek is a South African originally, a graduate of the University of Cape Town Medical School. He established the first Centre for Epidemiological Research in South Africa, and soon thereafter went to WHO, where he had a very important career. He became a member of Gro Harlem Brundtland's cabinet, and in that role was responsible for the tobacco control policy of WHO, and I think is fairly seen globally as being arguably the father of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which has now been agreed to by most countries in the world, and which has undoubtedly, single-handedly really, changed the war on tobacco globally. Subsequent to that role at WHO, Derek has had several positions. He was Professor of Public Health and head of the Centre for Global Health at Yale University. He was the head, the director of health, executive director of health at the Rockefeller Foundation. And then most recently, and a surprise to many of those who've known him for years, he has moved to PepsiCo, where he is now Vice President of Global Health Policy, and where he leads the internal Global Human Sustainability Task Force. He still continues to have a range of other engagements globally. He contributes to the Clinton Global Initiative, the World Economic Forum, the Oxford Health Alliance, and a number of others, including indeed serving, and this is probably the highlight of his career, on the George Institute's Scientific Advisory Committee. So on that, Derek, welcome to Sydney, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Stephen, and Rosemary, thanks for your words, and real pleasure to be here. It really was a highlight being at the George Institute, and I can certainly say that it is one of the exemplary groups involved in chronic diseases globally, a need that we really should be increasing. If I'd known that Rosemary wasn't going to use a PowerPoint presentation, I would have joined her, but so be it. Let me start off by saying that I would love to go into greater detail on some of the environmental issues that got raised, and in fact I will be doing that tomorrow night. So this is a plug for a talk I'm giving, I think, somewhere near here tomorrow evening, focusing particularly on some of the issues around environmental sustainability. I hope to try and go through this exhaustive list fairly briefly, and let me start off by just reminding us about the causes of obesity. But before doing that, I think it's sobering to reflect on the progress made by nations in their global health status and what we're facing. Basically, what we see in countries like Australia and most of the world has been unprecedented growth in life expectancy over the last few decades, fueled, I would argue, by improved education, improved food and the efficiency of the food industry, among others, dramatic changes in a reduction in infectious disease control, that have brought Australia to the brink of having the highest life expectancy in the world. Never forget that massive achievement that you have made when you start thinking about some of the future challenges that you continue to face. Clearly, when one thinks about obesity, one thinks about the US and the globalization. There's no question that we face a potential reversal of some of the progress we're making through obesity, which over the next few years could unfold in ways that will have an impact on the gains. I put this up to remind us that it is a global phenomenon. On the one side, you have the developed countries of the OECD, and on the other, you have the growth in small rural areas all the way through to the cities of China. I also like to remind people that the big difference between tobacco and obesity from an epidemiological point of view is that tobacco is a relatively efficient killer, whereas obesity is not, for a range of reasons. But the impact is going to particularly be felt in terms of high levels of morbidity and disability, which will obviously have enormous financial implications, perhaps beyond tobacco. So we all realize that we face some kind of tidal wave of obesity. The question is what we're going to do. I think Rosemary opened by saying there are many factors causing obesity. We would agree. And we start, many of us in industry start by going to the UK government's Foresight report, which really puts at the center the issue of energy balance. But very closely linked to the Foresight, the core, are a range of factors involving food production, consumption, biology, activity, individual psychology, societal influences. People who have not read this report, I'd urge you do. It's on the Foresight website. And people often put this up and say, look, everything's connected to everything else, therefore, what on earth can we do? The report does much more than that. It highlights which linkages have the bigger leveraging impact than others. It also identifies the role of many players. So when I read it from a food manufacturing perspective, I can see what we expected to do, and I'm going to return to that later. The problem often is surprising that the players who should be acting more decisively, like government in many parts of the world, are simply not. As an epidemiologist at heart, I like to ask a really basic question. Where are the calories coming from in obesity? How many of you have actually looked at the data to find out what are the contributions of various foods to the calories and to the increase in calories over the last few years in detail? I think you'll find some surprising results. If you take a global perspective, of course, the focus is often on sodas or soft drinks, as we have from the latest New York City Health Department. We would find that at the highest level of beverage consumption, probably in the UK, about 15% of calories in young people are coming from beverages, 15% in the 19 to 29-year-old age group, 2/3 of that from alcohol. I haven't heard many people talk about the role of alcohol in obesity in young people virtually anywhere in the world. I don't know the equivalent data here, but I can certainly tell you in the US, at a national level, about 5% come from soda, all soft drinks, and obviously much higher proportions come from a range of other foods, everything from pizza to Mexican dishes to chicken and prepared foods, and so you go on. In China and India, where we obviously are already concerned, the total beverage intake in calories is about 0.5 to 0.2%, depending on where you are in the country. I make that point because when we target interventions, we've got to make sure that we're going to target them to the greater proportion of the calorie intake that's going to have a difference, make a difference. And I'm sure in discussion we'll hear about, there'll be counter-arguments. I also need to give a perspective of how we as companies are thinking of the future. We are all too aware that particularly in developing countries, we face the reality of high levels of stunting in kids around the world. And simultaneously, we're seeing high levels of obesity. 1 billion people are overweight and obese in the world, 1 billion are hungry. Most of our markets are where you have that worst combination. And the question we have to face is, what is going to be the appropriate diet to avoid people moving rapidly from stunting into early onset obesity and diabetes? This has fundamental implications for how we structure our food supply in the future. We're also all too aware that there's variability in terms of what one can do to address obesity over the life course. The potential for prevention really closes pretty quickly by the end of the teens. And while there are some things you can do beyond that, much of the evidence doesn't suggest that we've seen success. So let's ask the question, what examples of successful reductions do we have? My answer is none, outside of a famine or economic blockade, but we've got some promising settings. So this is a representation by one of the successful studies, Somerville, run by Tufts University, which has actually published data over several years showing that when you combine all these complex groups, you can actually have a difference. This includes changing the diets, changing beverage consumption, changing what's sold in the schools, but all the activity-related things. It's still got to be scaled up across the country, and we're going to see it starting to be scaled up initially in the US and hopefully elsewhere. Early findings, the equivalent examples from France, from some states in the US, particularly Arkansas, of promising steps forward, but nothing substantive. The only substantive dramatic decline we've seen in obesity and obesity-related diseases and deaths is this data from colleagues Ben Caballero and others in the American Journal of Epidemiology from Cuba. The economic blockade had a very good effect on reducing obesity, cardiovascular disease, and type 2 diabetes, which rebounded when the blockade was limited. It's instructive because it did show that when people were shifted to higher levels of activity, when they did move into fruits and vegetables and many of the things Rosemary mentioned, you actually could see a change, but it put a pretty draconian set of policies to make it happen. What do we suggest in terms of policies globally? I think we have fairly clear guidance from WHO, and I was involved with the WHO when we developed this global strategy on diet, physical activity, which didn't only focus on obesity, it focused on all the dietary and activity aspects of chronic diseases. And I might say that in the process, I tried to hire a director of diet and physical activity, and was told by my academic colleagues around the world that that was not possible. I could get somebody with a nutrition and diet expertise or a physical activity or sports science expert, but we don't do people who actually understand the two. I was after an and type person, diet and physical activity, and I fear that we still do not have many and people who really understand where the interaction between the two exists. We came up with a bunch of ideas about nutrient guidelines, and in the process assessed what works and what doesn't work to reduce obesity, to reduce cardiovascular disease, diabetes. There were no surprises there. Clearly we had to do something about sugar levels, and we had to look at total calorie intake. We had to change the type and the amount of saturated fat. And anything you talk about reducing, there is a strong lobby outside which would come at you very forcibly, and of course they did. But Brundtland was our Director General, and this got approved by the Assembly. And just last week, I was with my WHO colleagues in Thailand at the International Congress on Nutrition, where the latest version of the action plan was highlighted, stressing the role for a wide range of activities. I think we've got a relatively good prescription. What we don't have is the specificity of actions. And I know Rosemary mentioned 5 or 6 points, which I hope to get to. I found it intriguing in preparing for this talk that your Preventative Health Task Force had aspired to make Australia the healthiest country by 2020. Given that you're already number 3, it's actually within your reach to do it. Only Japan and Sweden probably stand ahead of you. So as an aspiration, it's not something lofty and impossible. And the kind of prescriptions that came up with, I think we can all support, and many of us in industry have been through this document, maybe in greater depth than the public health community. I have always admired both Rob Moody and Michael Daub, who were the chair and co-chair of the committee, as being some of the great thinkers in public health from Australia, who've played a global role. Rob Moody has influenced a lot our efforts to try and get hypothecated taxes for tobacco around the world. It's unfortunately only really succeeded big time in Thailand, with a few smaller exceptions. So I think all of these issues highlight what we need to do, but again, don't have the level of specificity we need for obesity. This is just to remind us where you're headed, and we certainly know that if we're able to make progress, you'll actually bring those rates down even faster. So what are we doing? There were many reasons why the food industry responded to the call. And people like Rosemary, not that there are many people like Rosemary around the world, but the eloquence and the clarity of the argument has been heard by food companies, but not just by food companies. It's heard by the investment community. And when a report comes out like the proof of the pudding by JP Morgan, ranking us in terms of our obesogenic index, it's not something that our CEO nor the board likes very much, because it starts sending a signal to the market about these companies being potentially risky in terms of the kind of products they're selling. So it starts a really rigorous debate among the food industry and how we're going to respond. We also have a strong NGO group out there focusing on dumping sodas, and we have Margaret Chan from WHO calling for decisive action. On the other hand, though, we have ambivalence about whether we should even be talking between the food and the public health sector. And the ambivalence, I think, plays out in interesting ways. On the one hand, we have colleagues who I've worked with and admire, David Ludwig and Marion Nessel, basically saying to the answer to that question, no. We cannot play a constructive role. And at the bottom, the United Nations system imploring us to help them deal with the billion people who are hungry in the world and leveraging our capability to make a difference. We realize that the era of going this kind of route is probably not going to do it for us globally. This is an advert, for those who can't read it, for sanitized tapeworms as the solution to obesity. How do we think about obesity within a company? And I'll just take you inside the kind of presentation we would give to our senior executives, not to our R&D, health and nutrition, the people running the business. We see that there are three broad buckets of things we can do. Better nutrition, limit overconsumed nutrients, sodium, fat, and so on. Increase shortfall ones, where they truly are shortfall, and I take your point that often we don't have a scurvy problem in the US, so we probably don't need to add vitamin C to many things. Portion control, clearly a neglected big tool. Remember, for much of the world, we have a large affordable nutrition problem. There's a lot we can do. We do include the issue about redistributing calories through physical activity and making sure basically that we get all the nutrition in the calories that are right for you. And yeah, that may be a bit soft wording for what we want here, but that's being turned into very definable metrics. As an industry, 9 companies sent a letter to Margaret Chan at WHO, spelling out how it is we believe we could contribute to the global strategy on diet and physical activity. And they included explicit mention of product reformulation, changing our marketing to kids, addressing labeling in a common way, promoting physical activity, and building better partnerships. WHO responded by saying the thing they want to focus with us first is marketing to children. So we put together uniquely a little grouping called the International Food and Beverage Alliance, and through that got the 9 companies first to agree on a serious pledge we would make to the member states about not advertising certain products to kids under 12 worldwide. And they're detailed definitions of all of this we can share, and some of it's on our website. Very importantly, note the last line. The policy incorporates an independent, robust monitoring and compliance reporting system. This pledge was only made in December last year. So we about a year into it. We expect to have all of our policies in place by the end of next year. But we have started doing some independent market assessment in Europe across all the European countries, which made the pledge earlier. These are the companies, and together they constitute 83% of global food, beverage, restaurant advertising spend. Progress on the pledge is slow and steady. In Europe, we've seen in 2006, Australia, the beverage industry committed to the pledge. It's being put into full effect. Next year, Canada, the European Union. And we've seen over this year an enormous plethora of countries around the world making commitments. Now, this is not something that gets taken lightly by multinationals. When you make a pledge, a non-financial commitment, you are subject almost to the same level of oversight as we are on some of our financial pledges. So it becomes very important that we put in place an independent means of verifying, are we actually having the impact we desire? So what happened under the European Union? Over the last 4 years of the EU pledge, the European Union pledge, which covers 250 to 300 million people, 93% of programs with an audience of majority of children under 12, and 50% overall decline in the so-called non-compliant foods. These would be foods in the high energy density, high salt, sugar, fat product. Very importantly, note that while the focus was on the under 12 category, the spillover effect was across all ages. And to be more specific, and we have country-specific data, product and country-specific data. This was done by an independent audit agency called Accenture, who are known for their independent audit function. What you'll see over the last 3 to 4 years has been an increase in marketing around some of the pasta, rices, and wheats, a marginal increase in fruits and vegetables, both a good thing, a substantial decline in the carbonated soft drinks, confectionery, desserts, sugared snacks, savory snacks, and fruit juice marketing. These translate into millions and millions of dollars in shifts in marketing. It can be done. We've seen the same kind of shifts in the US in our categories in children under an agreement through an alliance which includes the Clinton Foundation and the American Heart Association. The same kind of shift we're starting to see, albeit not quite as large, but some are very substantial. A fairly dramatic decline in soft drink marketing, and a fairly steep increase in fruit and vegetable, I'm afraid to say increase in bottled water, Rosemary, but we can talk about that. There's always a cost of trying to do something over time, and we don't expect to achieve everything everybody wants in one shot. We've also done something which we never did before. We've gone out to try and talk and understand what really are the concerns of the major policymakers. And lurking in the back of this is me somewhere. I was, like here, the sole industry representative subjecting themselves to a public flogging in this time the Chilean Senate, where the leader of the Senate, trained by Ricardo Wawi, the head of the International Union of Nutrition Sciences, is also there, along with anybody who knows him, Phil James, the head of the International Obesity Task Force, and Pekka Puska, the head of the World Heart Federation. I make the point that previously we would not even be going there because we think we don't have a case, we don't want to hear, we don't want to listen, we don't want to understand how we can do more. Some other examples. In the UK, we have made real efforts to try and shift consumption from high-calorie to low-calorie versions, basically to max and diet as away from full-calorie. And the way we did it was to stop all marketing of full-calorie beverages in the UK for the last 4 to 5 years, and put it only behind diet and max. There has been a marginal benefit, and I put this up because Rosemary did make the point that we know how to market, and we can shift consumption by marketing. Actually, it's not so simple. I wish it were. I wish we really understood that we could simply take our dollars invested on full-calorie beverages, put them on diet or max, or put them on the healthiest beverages you want, whatever you want, and we'd get consumption changes to happen predictably. People don't behave predictably. We don't really understand the drivers of consumption behavior, and that is an area where we need to think about how we might reach out to the public health community and those involved in communications to understand how, if we've got the intent, we could really make this happen. This was a massive shift in marketing dollars. The good news is that the person who led the shifts in the UK, which didn't apply only to diet, they applied to sodium and to saturated fat and to a whole lot of other things, has now been pulled into corporate headquarters to head our new global efforts on marketing. One of the things we did in the UK with other companies was to provide non-branded support from our leading athletes, particularly those involved in football, to actually go out to the schools and start talking about healthy lifestyles. As I said, a non-branded program run through the government. In Australia, I think you're aware that we have made pledges equivalent to those made at WHO, and these, over the last year, have actually started to be documented. For our point of view, the focus on portion control is important, and there's some evidence of change, and also some evidence of change on the marketing side. Perhaps the most significant conceptual shift we made was last week when we announced in the US about 40 major companies at the level of the chief executive officer, and for our case, our CEO, Indra Nooyi, stood up at the Washington Press Club with the head of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which many of you may know provides $500 million for obesity control in the USA, mainly supporting NGOs. They're the ones who brought us the campaign for tobacco-free kids and some of the hardest hitting tobacco control activities. That same foundation is now partnering with this group, working with us, to make sure that the pledges we're making are subject to independent verification and metrics. And what does the program include? Well, it's simple in concept. It includes a focus on the workplace. And remember, we employ millions of people around the world, starting in the US. This is starting in the US with a goal to globalize it. And these are not just your ordinary additional little fitness programs. They're serious efforts at trying to stimulate calorie change in the workplace. Schools program building upon the very best in class in the US. And most importantly, product innovation around the marketplace. Starting a serious and significant discussion around calorie transparency, around how we might address energy density, how we might ensure access to healthier foods. Remember, because we have the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation working with us, we are all too aware of the comments, again, Rosemary mentioned, about how much energy it takes to burn this stuff off and that we're going to have to address the intake. We now know that the size of the gap for younger kids is probably about 125 calories difference between what they're currently consuming and what they need to consume if we're going to slow and prevent the obesity epidemic. It's dramatically huger if we're going to reduce the epidemic in obese people. But that 125 to 160 calorie we see as a quantitative target that we can and should go after. And one of the ways we're going after it is by starting to compete in ways in which we're competing in, I would say, healthy ways, which is the kind of competition we all welcome. You may have seen that Coke recently jumped ahead of all of us by announcing it'll put bold calorie labelings on the pack. You might say, well, who cares? But that is something you wanted, Rosemary. You're going to get it now. It's not going to only affect consumer behavior. It's going to affect corporate behavior because we're not going to want to have big numbers on packs. We're going to want to probably use that information to shrink our portion sizes. And I suspect it'll start an interesting new round of new portion sizes, starting to reverse some of the trends in supersizing. I know you might say, and Marion Nessel and Rosemary also said today very clearly, the business model simply can't work. If we sell less, we go out of business. Well, is that really the case? Here we have data showing that between 2003 and 2009, we increased the number of servings sold by 7%. In other words, we sold more stuff. But we reduced the calories consumed by 5%. How was that possible? Well, by shifting towards the low-calorie options, we were able to do that. And we think we could be doing that substantially more looking out to the future. The question of getting the business model right to reverse what has been decades of evolution is a really important issue. And I think that the schools of public health need to partner with the schools of business to think about how can we find a business model where we will find common interest between profitability and reducing obesity. I think if we don't do that, we will continue to have unnecessary battles. If we do, I think we will find innovative solutions to move ahead. Let me give you another example of real progress in the US in quantitative terms. We have an agreement with the beverage industry and the Heart Association of America and the Clinton Foundation to stop selling certain categories of beverages, particularly full calorie, to kids in the junior schools, and there's a graduated program. The goal being to reduce the supply of calories to the school system of the US. Well, 2 years out, after the first evaluation, we now know that we sold 65% less calories, full calorie CSDs, and there was a decline of 60% of calories being sold through beverages in the school system. We've got data coming up soon on snacks. That is actual calories sold out of the school system. That's quantitative change. We can calculate what that means for the diet of a child, and you can say, well, they're going to go outside the school and buy a big 30-ounce thing and come in and dispense it. Yes, there may be some of those entrepreneurial kids. Actually, there are probably a few of them. But the big figure seems to actually stand, and we've looked at it fairly carefully. You might say, well, they're going to overtake the reduction when they leave the school grounds. We don't see much evidence of that. We actually think this would then translate into just a few percent decline in calorie intake in kids. But it's every few little percent decline that's going to actually make a difference. We also know now from some of our changes in portion size in Frito-Lay worldwide that we have sold 300 billion fewer calories into the US food market over the course of the last, I think it's a year or two, simply through portion size and better portion control. It can work, and again, it's an example where there's a potential win-win for industry as well as for the consumer. And I hate to use the word consumer, but we are selling to consumers who are citizens, as are us, all employees in the company. I put this up because I know we have colleagues interested in our sodium progress, but I won't go into that. Let me, before ending, just talk about some realities that we face in other parts of the world. I'm not sure whether you would regard this as marketing to kids. Anybody regard it as marketing to kids? These are cartoon characters, and perhaps, yes, everybody's nodding. These are actually made by no known manufacturer, and they are typical of the products being sold in the informal sector around the world. There's nothing strange about this. We find it in Thailand, in India, the streets of Mexico, South Africa. I put this up because while in the developed country markets, we obviously have great control and the ability to bring in the legitimate trade to do things with us, in many parts of the world we don't. 2/3 of the snacks sold on the streets of South Africa are coming out of these kind of operations. And the color, by the way, we suspect is red enamel paint diluted and turned up in a cement mixer in somebody's backyard. The downside something of a heavy regulated approach needs to be thought through. And for many developing countries, that may very well mean tilting the playing field in favor of the more harmful, more marketed, more dangerous products than those which we will comply with. So, last few comments. Rosemary talked about the importance of addressing sustainable development. It's at the core of a lot of our thinking, and I'll go into it in greater detail tomorrow, so I won't mention it now. I highlighted that WHO just last week stressed the important role of the private sector, and I would argue that we are starting to make modest progress on all of these elements, not at the speed that we would like. And why don't we go faster? Well, we can only go as fast as there is responsiveness by all of you and by consumers and also by governments. We know that there are certain realities which we have to address, and it's not a question of trying to cook up some science, but we have to ask profound questions in regard to sweetener of what is our goal in reducing the levels of sugar in beverages. Is the goal to try and simply replace what we have with natural sweeteners, something which we are doing around the world? Or is it to try and lower the propensity for sweetness, which would take obviously a long period of time, which would require rethinking what we do things in early childhood? I ask that question because I don't think it's one we've answered, and it becomes incredibly important as we start thinking about our strategy moving ahead. It's not a trivial issue. The same issues relate to sodium, but there the answer is a bit clearer. By the way, this is from the Yale Center for British Art and gives the wonderful paintings by Mercier on the 5 senses. I put it up to remind you that the one area where the food industry has excellence is in the area of sensory perception and taste. How are we going to apply that knowledge to a far greater extent to some of our challenges? How are we going to get people in the health community to start recognizing the critical importance of taste and the people that are not willing to compromise on taste as we make our changes? I won't go into that. I would also remind you that as we move ahead on physical activity, we weren't talking about physical activity in the schools. We're talking about deep structural changes occurring in societies around the world that we're not talking about enough. This is the reality of what's happening in Shanghai. Anybody who goes there knows that the era of the bicycles being displaced by what you see on the other side. This is not an issue for us to try and fob off on others. It's an issue profoundly, actually, of sustainable development, because the very determinants of us leading to the life of motor cars and an anti-activity lifestyle will be harmful both for the environment, for cardiovascular disease, and for obesity. And we're not seeing a greater commonality of interest. Before ending with this, it was a privilege to be here, and it reminds me of the last time I had a chance to be with colleagues from the public health community was at the London School, where we, again, I think had a really important series of discussions. And the goal I always have in these discussions is not to emerge with agreement, because that is often impossible, but to actually agree that we need to actually talk. And there's some areas where we not only could talk, but we could actually start taking action for the common interest without saying we have to agree on the whole bundle of activities. The most inspirational work, I think, that guides many of our work, I know Steve Lederer, Stephen McMahon, and many of us here, is the experience that you can make a difference. I was with Pekka Puska last week, and I hope all of you in public health have studied his work. If not, please speak to your faculty about that enormous gap in your knowledge. This represents the greatest contribution to public health in terms of lives saved, far greater than the work in many of the infectious disease areas. And he showed that through sustained action over 30 years, we can actually bring the heart disease death rates down. And we can do it in a systematic way that included working with the private sector, the right combination of incentives and disincentives by government, a clear government mandate in monitoring, setting the scene, and a responsive public who understood why this needed to happen. I put in the little caveat that even Finland faces a slow, steady increase in obesity and doesn't quite know what it needs to do. Our argument is that we need to do all of the things we spoke to, but with a greater degree of urgency. Lest you think that I'm alone in this, I just put up this photograph we took last week in Thailand at the World Congress of some of my colleagues from around the world who were with me, and they include people you'd be surprised to hear of a food company employer. The man in the middle is our head of R&D worldwide, a endocrinologist from the Mayo Clinic who spent many years heading worldwide R&D for Takeda Pharmaceuticals, addressing obesity and metabolic diseases. On the one side, on the extreme, you have a colleague from the Joslin Diabetes Center who's joined us now to understand behavioral economics and how we're actually going to influence behaviors for the good. And in the team, we have people with detailed knowledge around many of the aspects we require to make a difference. I think as a group of companies, and certainly our company, is more than in a position to make a difference. The question is whether you are willing to partner to make it happen. Thank you.